Welcome to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. In this podcast, we break down high-profile celebrity estate planning cases for advisors and their clients. Most celebrity estate catastrophes are based on the same issues that everyday people face, just with the volume turned up. Our goal is to identify and extract the individual estate planning issues that lie at the heart of each story. We then discuss what advisors should expect and how to avoid common pitfalls. Hosted by WealthManagement.com Senior Editor David Lenok.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of WealthManagement.com's Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous. For anyone new to the podcast, in each installment, myself and a guest take on a different celebrity estate and attempt to extract some key lessons that planners can apply to their more traditional clients. The idea being that celebrity estate planning stories, although often ridiculous in their details, generally have at their cores very basic issues that can just as easily apply to non-famous or fabulously wealthy clients. Our guest this week is Tim Volk. He's the architect of a highly successful entrepreneurial career that encompasses independent advisory, strategic planning, and financial services. As founder and principal of Volk and Company, a boutique advisory firm that specializes in assisting closely held businesses, family offices, single and multifamily, and family-controlled enterprises, he leverages his own experience in a successful legacy family business and provides prudent and trusted counsel to families striving to protect their enterprises and preserve their wealth. Thanks for joining us again today, Tim.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Dave.
So this episode will be a bit different and a bit more half-baked than usual. As opposed to talking about a single celebrity, we'll be discussing an entire family, the British royal family, to be more specific.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, the recent death of Queen Elizabeth gives us our nominal excuse to include the Windsors on the show. Instead of focusing specifically on Elizabeth, Tim and I will have a more free-form discussion about the family as a whole, or at least the last half century or so of it, and how in many ways they are the perfect embodiment of the sentiment that I open every episode of this show with. Though an entire industry has sprung up around covering their every move, coverage that is subsequently devoured breathlessly by millions of royal watchers the world over. When you take a step back and look at what's actually happening at their core, the Windsors and the Crown really aren't all that different than a more typical high net worth family and a family business. I've laid out a pretty wide-ranging hypothesis here, but there's no real obvious jumping off point to get us started. So let's stick with what we do best on the show and start with the death, Elizabeth's to be specific. Her tragic passing, and more importantly, the atypically long life that preceded it, kicked off one of the most hotly anticipated successions in history. However, unlike most of the celebs we talk about on this show, there was not only an estate plan in place, but one that's fairly simple and basically, and perhaps literally, written in stone for hundreds of years. And everyone in the family, and millions around the world, knew exactly how things were going to shake out. Tim, I've spoken a great deal in the past about the need for transparency and flexibility in planning. The Windsors turned the transparency knob up to 11, and the flexibility one as low as it can possibly go. How does having everyone be aware of the details of a plan, but there being basically no wiggle room in said plan, affect a high net worth family?
Well, it's a great question, David. I think it's one that people think about quite a bit in the sense of how can we make sure the plan's effective. And when you think about the royal family, one, I'm just always in awe of her life and her service to the country and to mankind. She was just remarkable, and I think we have to honor the passing of her as a it's just a remarkable figure for us. And if you think about the family, it's 1,000-year-old family. So here we're talking about a structure that's 1,000 years old. Very few, if any, that I know of are families that we can reference like that. So we have a lot to learn from them. And I think it's amazing to see how they've evolved and transformed over the years, given all the different family members they've had in and out. In the family itself, there's a resilience to the family and the structure, even though they deal with all the same issues that everybody else does. The drama, theirs just gets played out in front of us every day on the news. I mean, they have people waiting to find out stuff or actually secretly finding out the stuff and then exposing it. So in some ways they face more challenge than a lot of the families in that respect. But I think very, very wealthy families, people are obsessed with them. They're just the the popularity of Succession. And if you come from a family business, and my friends will say, well, we watch Succession, so is that just like your family business? I'm like, yeah, just like it. Yeah, we
Exactly.
have twin jets that we all fly around in, and everybody's got helicopters. Yeah, that's just totally realistic. No. And I think that sometimes the transparency that we see with the royal family, I think, is unique, because I think a lot of times families don't share what's going to happen. Look at Rupert Murdoch.
Mhm.
He's not.
Speaking of
Kid,
Succession, right?
right. That he acts like he's never going to live. At least with the Queen, we knew exactly what was going to happen. Everybody knows their role. They had surprises when her uncle abdicated, obviously, and her life took a very different trajectory. But in some respect, that transparency, as you said, doesn't provide any more flexibility. So let's just assume that the families that had transparency, some other family, and they've shared with their children exactly what's going to happen. Although I don't know very many that have shared everything.
Certainly not to this degree where everyone knows with certainty, unless someone dies, what's happening.
I just don't know a lot of family. I think one of the challenges we have in wealth management is getting people to talk about what they want.
Yeah.
And it's so typical with a family. Like I had clients that were a group of siblings that were running a family business, very successful, and they'd been in the leadership roles for a long, long time. So when I met with them, they kept talking about their kids, and I had already done interviews of everyone in the family, and they were talking about their children. I said, I have to stop for a minute. Are you talking about your children who are in their 30s and 40s with children, or are you talking about your grandchildren? Or I'm almost sure one or two of the grandchildren could almost have children. And I'm just confused. They all started to laugh at me, and they said, well, of course, we're just talking about our kids, our children, our direct children. I said, you mean the ones that have like 20 degrees amongst them and
and are 60?
Are 40 years old, and they're the leading, a couple of them have advanced dual degrees of PhD and MDs. And I mean, they're laughing at me going, what are you trying to say? I said, well, when you talk to the kids, they want to know what you want. And when I'm talking to you, you keep waiting for the kids to step forward. But neither one of you are telling them what you want.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a standoff at the OK Corral, and no guns, nobody's talking. They're so far away they can't hear each other, but nobody's even trying to talk. But everybody's waiting.
Exactly. It's like these two knobs that I mentioned, sort of transparency and
flexibility.
Flexibility are, like sort of what you're messing with in a plan to sort of make it stand the test of time, right? You're sort of trying to find the right rotation of them to make the plan last. Whereas, in the case of the royal family, it's all on transparency. Everyone knows what's going to happen. So there's there's no fighting it, especially after 1,000 years. It's just this ball is rolling downhill. There's no room to fight it. But in terms of, keeping a family together, then, maybe it's lacking a little bit, right? Because, if there's no room to fight it, then that means there's less room for individuality within the people in the family and less sort of alternatives. You're kind of trapped in the edifice, for lack of a better term. And I think, we see a bit of this and a bit of what you're talking about with the sort of who are the children, these older generations with Charles, right? Because Queen Elizabeth, he's been Prince Charles for a very, very long time. And sort of he's been the assumed king for a very long time, to the point where people kind of forgot about him at this point. Like they've looked past him. He's been waiting so long, and Elizabeth lived so long. And he's almost basically like missed his inheritance, even though now he is King Charles. It's like, but he's so old at this point that we're already turning around and planning for him to not be king anymore before he's even king. And I think, this makes me think of a lot of families today where it's like by the time the head of the family business is willing to turn over the business to their kid, the kid is 65 years old, and he's immediately going to have to start thinking about his own succession, where there's like this lost generation, basically. This is like the Gen X people for the most part, and slightly older, are, as people are living longer, are getting caught in this sort of in-betweeny role in these families fairly often. And, we talk about this idea of the great wealth transfer that was just supposed to happen, has been supposed to happen for the last 25 years.
Exactly.
And isn't happening yet. And it's sort of, what we may see is that it just skips an entire generation, right? When it finally does happen, it's not going to be the people we assumed are going to be getting it. It's going to be their children. And I think that Charles is sort of a good example of this, where by the time he gets it, he's already got to figure out how to give it.
I think it's a combination of people not recognizing the stage of life they're in.
Yeah.
And then perhaps there's such a fear that they, we can even use my own family. And I think there's a fear sometimes of bringing everybody together because they don't want the children to fight.
Mm-hmm.
And then the conversation is like, what are we going to tell them? And Charles, for example, I think he was given assignment and had great duties all along. Now he's King Charles. I do have to say that a speech he gave about his mother, I thought was just phenomenal. I thought it was the speech of a lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
And so he has assuming the role, and he's doing it with grace and dignity. He has the same value set that I think his mother had because he was raised around it. His mom and dad. We forget that they're human. That his mom and dad yelled at him. They didn't like all the things he said. He, would say things and storm out of the room, I'm sure. Or they told him that was enough talking, with a lovely British style, which is very, respectful. Where in America we could have, there's probably a lot more expletives.
It would have been a more Jerry
Yeah.
Springer sort of situation. Yeah.
But I do think that there's something there about how the heads of the families are really struggling with who they choose to be the successor.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has to do a lot with their own bias. Sometimes I think that they think that nobody's going to do it better than them. And perhaps if they turn it over and they fail. But what's even worse, maybe if they do a great job and exceed every expectation and performance that they did. And I think that this is going back to what stage of life you're in. So, there's the movement from adulthood to eldership. And we need some of the families, we need the elder generation to step into being elders. And I liken it to my good friend James H. Hughes, who's written quite a few books, affectionately known as J. Hughes, talks about looking at tribal culture. And the elder's role is really to be able to be there to settle disputes that cannot be settled by the family, to let the family know when they're off course. And then if the family members come to them for guidance, they don't really tell them how to do it. They just assure them some of what's happened in the past. So they're kind of keepers of the history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that role of eldership, I think, is so important, and mentoring is so important. So
yeah, I think that's a really good point, this idea of eldership. And also I just want to add that that's something that needs to be cultivated. It's not something that's just bestowed on you when you hit a certain age and retire. You have to, I think that's part of the problem that we see with certain family businesses, is that, especially first generation family businesses, is that, the founder of the business has spent so much time and put so much of themselves into building the business that they haven't cultivated this respect as the elder beyond just being like the one who has the wallet. And so, they are less capable of transferring into that elder role because they haven't done the legwork. And they spent too much time on the business. And then once they give up the purse strings, well, why am I respecting you at all? I don't even know you.
Yeah, I think that's a very clear. I mean, your family members, let's just face it, sometimes when we're talking about wealth management and transfer of the assets, it's a transfer. It becomes a business transaction, right? Which we know in planning, that's not the right idea. The idea is that we want to convey the level of love and expectation that comes with the money. Money in and of itself, I think, is ephemeral. I mean, if you're chasing money, it's an empty chase. The families that I find that I admire the most are the families that help to instill a level of I don't know, like a level of satisfaction in how they find life. They pursue their interests. They want to serve others. They want to have a legacy that you're going to leave with in the world. So are you, as a parent that's running a family business, it's an enormous undertaking to run a family business or run any business. And if you're doing it very successful, it's all encompassing. But we do know that families that help engage other family members to help lead the family or help to nurture the family are the ones that succeed the most. We talk about family governance, which is a very heavy term, but basically family governance is about how to help the families come together to make good joint decisions about assets that we may share.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yes.
I don't know that we have a lot of great examples of that, because if you watch television or you watch movies, it's all about the drama. It's all about the fighting. But we really know that there are families that have done a great job of that. They're in the family, they're in their 5th or 6th or 7th generation. And they've done an excellent job of nurturing the family.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's interesting. You don't hear about them though, right? It's almost like the reverse
right.
Instagram, where like instead of showing only the perfect vacation and not all like the crap that went into getting there, like, you know, like, oh, I'm stuck between 2 fat guys, you know, sitting in the middle seat on the plane there. I just
Right.
so like, hey, I'm there. This is the reverse of that, right? Where we only hear about the ones that mess up on, you know, like snarky podcasts, for example. And but you know, the ones who do a great job necessarily, you know, aren't. It's more under the radar. You have that sort of confirmation bias almost, where all we're hearing about is the ones that mess up, so everyone must be messing up.
Right. And everybody loves to hear about what rich families are doing.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we know if you look around and you look at some of the big institutions that we have in this country that are really remarkable, many of them were created by super wealthy families that helped to endow them or helped to create them. It's remarkable, the families around the turn of the 19th century to the 20s, from the 1890s to I don't know, 2015, that golden era. There were enormous of a level of industrial families that were hugely wealthy, and they impacted so much of the life that America has today. Libraries, schools, hospitals, research, well, things that really are the benefit to, you know, infrastructure, transportation. And we don't talk about those things that the families created that were a tremendous value to our lives today, that made America great. And we're the only country in the world that looks at philanthropy the way we look at it. So it's a tax, just, you know, it's a tax incentivized decision, but it's also for the greater good of the world. So I think families can self-actualize better in the sense that they look beyond themselves. They look beyond the money and what they're going to do. What is it that they can help the family rally around? Maybe your family rallies around food bank, hunger. So then it teaches all the children and the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren, to look beyond themselves, because this is what we do as a family.
It also creates roles, right? Which I think in a lot of these families is important. There is, you know, it's very easy to become stuck and defined as something when you're a part of one of these families. But there's only one king, right? There's only one CEO. But then there's all these other family members who have dedicated their lives to sort of upholding the values of the family and are not going to get that, you know, giant carrot on the stick at the end. But, you know, you can create roles for them other than just being, oh, the other guys who are in this family. So, you know, though you can't be maybe someone else's head of the family, you know, a second child can be head of the giving arm of the family, or head of the, you know, there's philanthropy in that way. It creates a lot of roles where, you know, some of the forgotten, let's call it, family members can carve out niches for themselves and identities and still represent the family in all things they do, but do it in a way that it feels like they're contributing. They're important. You know, they're not number one, but they're still a person who's integral to what the family is doing.
Exactly. I think I've met families, or the heads of the family business, and they may be the head of the board, the family board, if there's a board. And then they may try to create the family council, which is what we just talked about, as sort of the basis of families, putting each branch of the family has a representative, that their being of the council is, the purpose of the council is to help steward the lives of the family, to make sure everybody's good and okay. And so then they try to do that too. And I'm like, okay. And then family members will say, yeah, they never have time for the family council meeting, or they're trying to rush through it. And I'm like, okay, so why didn't you, Aunt Susie could be the one you want to use. Aunt Susie's the one that always has got all of the events planned. Yeah. She's the one that
never misses one of
the
these
family,
things.
never misses anything. She's got she has that informal communication where she talks to everybody, even though some of the people don't, you know, they all have their own little fiefdom or biases. She seems to have the ability to talk to everybody. So why wouldn't you look at her as being one of the leaders of the family? And what's the old saying? There's no I in team.
Yeah.
So I think, as we said earlier, Rupert Murdoch is a prime example. His children are aging out; they're doing other things. I think one of the sons has walked away, if I'm not mistaken.
I think one of them is on the other side of the political spectrum too. I think,
right,
yeah, so
right. So you lost. The belief is that in families, I think you've heard me talk about this before. There are 5 capitals to a family: the financial capital, which is what everybody talks about, but the other capital, the human, the intellectual, the social, and the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
The intellectual and human capital, we do a great job of nurturing that typically in a business, right? You're worried about your talent. You're worried about what we're doing to create unique opportunity, what we're doing. But in the family, we don't always get together at dinner on Sunday and go, the great value in our family is all the human capital sitting here. And the intellectual capital you guys are nurturing. We just don't do it, although it's important. And the social capital, of course, is what is this for? What is the money going to do? And the spiritual capital is what binds us together. What's our value system? What are the values that we as a family have, and how are we going to make sure that we pass those on and they're enduring? And it's just so funny because we know that then those 4 capitals get nurtured by the financial capital. It's not the financial capital pulling those other 4 capitals. It's if you had your hand out and you had all 5 capitals, the financial capital is your thumb. You want to turn it so it's at the bottom. And then you're like, oh, well, that kind of makes more sense because we really do need to nurture this. And
because the rest of the things are what actually keeps the family together, right? The financial one is just sort of patches.
Right. It's I find the great wealth transfer. One of my friends the other day, I'm sitting in the Ultra High Net Worth Institute's meeting, and I'm sitting there, and one of my friends just takes out a napkin. They were talking about the great wealth transfer. He says, look, I've been in the business 30 years. He starts drawing a diagram and he goes, half of the 50% is held by baby boomers, 42% is by the great generation. So we're talking about 8% right now. And he says, I've been waiting 30 years for this great wealth transfer. I just started cracking up because we all have. You've listened to it for all these years. It's people are living longer. The controls are there. The money hasn't necessarily changed hands per se. I mean, it happens, I'm sure, more than we know, but it certainly hasn't been this massive waterfall effect that everybody's talked about. So what are we doing?
Yeah, it's certainly like lumping people into generations is certainly kind of an obsolete construct. If it ever was relevant, it's completely irrelevant now. Because when people were born now is like so completely decoupled from when they die that it's impossible to sort of predict these things. Like, oh, boomers are going to die X, Y, Z. It's like, oh, that's crazy. Like a boomer does a natural death of 40 years apart, nowadays. It's not unusual, any of them.
Wow. So, and how old was the queen when she died?
90 something, right?
95?
Yeah.
96, something like that.
Yeah. So, she was queen. I mean, most of the world never knew another monarch for Britain before her.
Right.
They couldn't remember. So it's like she'd been queen so long that she was the monarchy effectively.
Now, if the families all do that, if we all live to 100, and some of my nieces and nephews are like, yeah, we probably will live to 120. I'm like, God help us. But let's see, if we live to 100, then when should we be trying to establish the other members of the family? Where should we be nurturing that? The transparency, we've got to actually increase the transparency, right? Just to your point.
Which and to what point? To what point do we stop thinking about just giving things to the next generation? Stop focusing on giving things to the next generation. Like at a certain age, all you're doing is hurting your plan almost by giving things to the next generation, because you're gonna have to go through all the taxes and the rigmarole of passing it to them, and then they're just gonna have to turn around and do that again.
We create these structures, trusts, correct?
Yeah,
the trust will live on forever. Some of them, or long term, they can have a rule against perpetuity, like in Wyoming, you could have 1,000-year trust.
Take them to a special magical trust jurisdiction.
But even let's just say it's 100-year life. I mean, so the purpose of the trust of the trustees is to steward the lives of the beneficiaries. But I don't think when we draw the trust, I don't think when the people, and this is what Jay Hughes and a group of people have really been talking about lately, and I think his new book's about, is just how do the people live within the plan? In other words, are we thinking about the children's life or the grandchildren's life when we develop the trust? Are we thinking about how they live within that in the context of their life? So the terms of the trust, you can write anything in a trust and say that it was the love of your mother and I and the great success that we were able to have, that we are giving this to you with great hopes that you will impact the world and make it a better place. Not only find your passion and be able to share that and have a happy life that you share with someone else, but you also will impact people for the good. That's a very different message than, say, you've now received $5 million. So it's a transfer. There's three things that we talk about, and that is, there's the gift of love, which is really what I think all families are trying to do. I really do think it's a gift of love, but it becomes a transaction or a transfer, which misses that very important point, which then results in the third thing that we try to deal with, which is entitlement. Nobody wants an entitled person.
I mean, how much, this is one thing I always wonder, and I'm always interested to ask people who work with high net worth families about, I mean, how much of a problem is entitlement versus, like, in comparison, obviously it is a problem, but in comparison to how much we worry about it being a problem?
I think it's a huge issue.
Okay.
I actually think it's probably the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a result of us failing to do what you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's a failure of the transparency and the flexibility in our planning and the communication. And then we get upset. And then you see people that are trying to control it from the grave by putting the trust and control it, like you can't get you till you're 30, and then you're going to get this and that and this, instead of saying, here's the expectation we have, and here's what we want you to do.
It's kind of the opposite of what you just said, right? Instead of planning for how the person is going to live with this trust, it's more planning first of how I want to give it to you, or how I, it's like,
don't you just sometimes want
to,
you kind of want to walk up to somebody like a Rupert Murdoch and say, so you got it right when you were young? Because wasn't he like fairly young when he started the newspaper?
Oh yeah.
Right. So don't you want to walk up and go, so you got everything right out of the gate? You never made mistakes. So you don't want your
crazy.
kids to ever make
and all the
mistakes.
kids, as you mentioned earlier, you're talking to kids with multiple degrees. It's like a lot of times these kids are so dramatically more qualified to take over these businesses than when their parents were when they started them. That it's just like, people can't see the forest for the trees sometimes.
It's always interesting when you grow up in a family business, right? Because your family business has all this drama that goes on because, and in our family business, it was my great grandfather that started the business, and he had a daughter. He and my great grandmother Anne had a daughter, Betty, and Betty Wallach married Roy Volk, hence the Volk, which is my last name. And then Roy and Betty had twin sons. And so through the generations, my grandfather, Roy Volk, worked for his father-in-law, Jack Wallach. And of course, they're very critical, but Roy was outperforming, doing great things, taking the company to the next level. And of course, their sons, my dad and uncle, were identical twins, took the business to a far bigger level. And my grandmother used to beam about it. She would tell everybody and all of her friends about how great her sons were until she was with her sons. And then she would just let them have it. And it was the comedy of comedy to watch, because there was a story. My grandmother was a smoker, and she smoked Benson and Hedges 100. So she'd pull up in her Cadillac, she'd get out of her car in front of the office, she'd light up before she came in. Now we have a no smoking policy in the office. And she'd walk in and she'd light, and all the smokers would just inhale, because here comes the chief. And she'd walk right into my dad's office with her cigarette, and my dad would say, Mom, we have a no smoking policy. She said, nobody ever asked me about that, and I was here long before you were. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be sitting in this fancy chair. And it's the comedy of watching that, the humility in that. Mm-hmm. But I think that gave my folks a much more humble perspective of the world. I think it gave all of us a different view of the world. She just was that type of person.
Because it's so easy to, when you're a member of one of these families, to ascend, to a position of wealth and power, that to forget that it wasn't you that did this all alone. And you have to be constantly reminded that, like, hey, like there were other people who helped you build this. This wasn't just a singular work of your amazing genius, right? For the most part, occasionally it is, but for most families, it takes a village, right, to make these things happen. So sometimes a smack in the face from the one who created you is a useful tool to get you back in the right headspace.
And it's fun to watch is if you're the grandchild or the great grandchild, you get a smile on your face. But the point there would just be that there has to be some way to ground the people in these roles. How do you help to see it? And some people are naturally that way. I think, considering the success and enormous genius of Bill Gates, right? He's a pretty, I don't want to call him a nerd, but he's kind of like a pretty down to earth person. He's
I don't think calling Bill Gates a nerd is really particularly outrageous.
Okay,
I think
good.
even he would say
good.
that.
I didn't want to get kicked off the show, but yeah, he would probably say he's a nerd. And so I think, well, he seems pretty down to earth, and his philanthropy is like groundbreaking. The way they go about it is really quite remarkable. And he's, some people would say second generation wealth, but I think he's really the first generation wealth to create the kind of success and wealth that he created.
That level of wealth is certainly not second generation. Yeah.
But his dad was around, his parents are around, and they were very, very much right there with him. So maybe there's something, I don't know what the lesson there is for us, but there is a lesson there. And his kids were much younger, of course. And so it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah, that's always an interesting part, right? Because Elon Musk came from a wealthy family too, and apparently the old emerald mine upbringing isn't so great for preventing megalomania. So we'll see. I think your mileage may vary.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and there's an example of maybe the genius and the others, the side effect of the genius, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're seeing families that have really struggled with, because we see families that struggle with all the dynamics that other families have, like addiction or entitlement, but sometimes I think we're not recognizing the talent, and we're not nurturing that younger generation's passion, helping them to identify it. And it's a sad thing, because how do you live in the shadow of this great person? You're living in the shadow of it.
Well, yeah, unless they move a little or give you a little spot of light to have cast your own shadow. It's an important part of the process. Is
right. It's larger than life.
Not ensuring that shadow blocks everyone out. And that's what the best family leaders do.
We see that in Jay, as I talk about him so much, but one of the sayings he has is that when people inherit the money, when that money gets transferred, it's like a meteor hits these family members.
Yeah.
Particularly if they've not been prepared for it, which it would be surprised at how many members are not prepared for what happens.
Mm-hmm. In both directions too, of the people I've spoken to, because you'd be surprised. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but I think our listeners might be surprised by what, some parents will never tell their kids that they're wealthy. And so, the kids they're like a lottery winners. Yeah. Almost, where it's like, oh, yeah, I thought we were farmers, like, well, yes, but we're massive industrial farmers. It's, we didn't tell you that part.
We have a little company called Cargill.
Yeah.
And, or, we have oil that we were giving oil rights to. And so we have oil under the ground, and we haven't told you about it. And it just amazes me and I don't have an answer to this, by the way. I think it's a study in the practice that I have is that you are working with families on how to discover their own path with this, because every family, we see the same issues, we see similar issues. Every family wants to tell you they're different, and I want to say, well, yes, you're different, but the issues are very similar, and so we can learn from each other.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole point of the podcast, and why we're even talking about the royal family, right? Is that
right?
These things, if you strip away the silliness, at the end of the day, it's the same stuff. Everyone's dealing with addiction. Everyone's dealing with mommy loved you more. Everyone's dealing with having to live up to, mommy or daddy, whoever's number one.
I just finished writing a chapter on inclusion for a book, and I was watching Crazy Rich Asians. Have you watched it?
I have, yes.
And the scene where the son is at home and he's brought home his girlfriend is a PhD at teaching professor at economics at Columbia, right? And he says to his mom, I thought you'd be happy that the first girl I bring home is a Chinese girl. And she says she's Chinese American, the worst. And I started laughing, and I watched the movie. I took all these notes because I realized that this sense of inclusion, and I don't think with family inclusion, the opposite is exclusion. I think it's more like disenfranchisement.
Mm-hmm.
And then look at Prince Harry
and Meghan, yeah,
compared to Prince William, his brother, and the brother fight. And he talks about how his brother beat him. And I'm like, we're brothers. Of course they had fights. Are you kidding me?
That's what brothers do, yeah. But one brother was the king who can't be touched, the once and future king, and the other is just the spare.
And what if I made this crazy remark that said, well, what if Meghan just wasn't a nice person? Maybe they just don't like her. It had nothing to do with her. What if when you meet her, it wouldn't be the first time a family didn't like the potential spouse.
No, it's a very common problem.
Right.
And that's before we get into any of the also very common, sadly, racial connotations that are there.
Of course.
So those are all things that every family deals with, and even if she's great, even if, the first son's wife and the second son's wife are very similar, a lot of times that second son's wife is going to be less well received.
Well, and there's been a bit of a track record in the family. There's been a bit of a challenge lately, right? So I would think that here's a great lesson. It's a great thing for us to be able to learn from and maybe not be so critical of, because for the grace of God, there goes us, right?
Exactly.
I'm not sure that we're that different. Well, of course we're different than the royal family, but the problem's similar, right?
Less jewels, but our issues are the same.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really great place to wrap things up because we're running out of time here.
Okay.
I'd like to thank Tim Volk for, as always, being a really fantastic guest and sticking with me on this sort of meandering, ill-planned chat that I set us up for here and making it hopefully something pretty interesting. Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here.
And for all the listeners, I'll see you, or I guess you'll hear me, on the next episode of Celebrity Estates, Wills of the Rich and Famous.
Thank you for listening to the Celebrity Estates Wills of the Rich and Famous podcast. Click the subscribe button below to become notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of WealthManagement.com. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.